Before you read this, understand one thing. This is not a story about revenge. Revenge is for people who are still angry. This woman was not angry. She was done being angry. She had moved past angry into something quieter, something colder, something that looks a lot like patience from the outside, but feels like a sharpened blade from the inside. She did not plan to take anyone out. She did not sit in a dark room drawing diagrams with red string. She did not call a lawyer on the first day, or the second, or even the third. On the third day, she sat in her car in a parking garage at 11:47 at night, and she ate a gas station sandwich, and she cried until her face hurt. That was day 3. This story begins before the fall. It has to, because if you don't know what she built with her hands, with her years, with every sunrise she showed up for when anyone reasonable would have stayed in bed, then you won't understand what it meant when they took it. And if you don't understand what they took, you won't feel what it cost her to get back up. And if you don't feel that cost, the end of this story will just look like a scoreboard. It is not a scoreboard. It is a woman who was knocked down by the first institution that was supposed to protect her, who got up, who built again, who was knocked down by the second institution, the one she had trusted even more, the one she had given more of herself to, and who from the floor of that second fall decided something. She decided she was going to become the most dangerous thing either of them had ever underestimated. Not with weapons, not with lawyers at first, with time, with documentation, with the kind of stillness that frightens people who are used to being loud. 286 Navy SEALs watched what happened next, not as bystanders, as witnesses, as men who had spent their careers measuring human endurance in salt water and sleep deprivation and blood and cold, men who had a precise internal instrument for detecting who could be broken and who could not, and they watched this woman finish what she started. This is how she started it. Her name was Veronica Diaz, and she was the kind of woman who showed up early. Not aggressively early. Not the kind of early that announces itself and expects applause. She showed up 15 minutes before anyone else, made the coffee, read through the day's brief, and was already 2 steps into her first task by the time her colleagues were still pulling off their coats. She had been doing this since she was 19 years old. She had been doing this at the Federal Law Enforcement Agency, where she worked for 11 years. It was not performance. It was just how her brain worked. She could not be still when there was work. She did not know how. She grew up in El Paso, Texas, in a house where early meant survival. Her father left for the oil fields before the sun touched the horizon. Her mother ironed school uniforms at 5 in the morning because if the uniforms were not ironed, certain teachers at their particular school had a way of looking at the Diaz children that her mother refused to give them the satisfaction of. Veronica was the second of 4. She learned to read her mother's face like weather. She learned to calibrate. She learned that preparation was the only thing standing between a family like hers and the particular cruelty the world kept ready for people who showed up unprepared. She was not supposed to work in federal law enforcement. Her mother wanted nursing. Her high school counselor wanted community college. Her father, when she told him the plan at 17, sat very still for a long time and then said with a precision she never forgot that some doors open for some people and not for others, and she should be sure she understood which kind of door she was trying to walk through. She understood. She walked through it anyway. The application process took 2 years. The physical requirements nearly finished her the first time. She ran until her shins turned into something that felt like ground glass wrapped in skin. She passed. The written examinations she handled without drama. The psychological evaluations she passed on the first attempt, which her evaluator told her was not common. The background investigation reached back in her family like a hand going through a drawer, sorting. It found nothing alarming. She was hired. The academy was 18 weeks of organized suffering. She was one of 4 women in her cohort of 22. She knew better than to expect the 4 of them to be allies. Sometimes people who share a difficulty use each other as proof that the difficulty is survivable rather than as company. But she watched the other 3 with the same careful attention. She gave everything. 2 of them washed out by week 8. One finished 2 ranks ahead of Veronica. Veronica finished 3rd overall. Her first posting was administrative. She did not complain. She understood that administrative work, done precisely, was how an institution learned whether it could trust you with anything more. She treated every intake form and every piece of documentation as if someone's life depended on its accuracy, because in the work she wanted to do eventually, it would. Her supervisor at the time was a man named Gerald Sutton, 53, 27 years with the agency, the kind of man who had calcified somewhere around 2004 and stopped updating. He was not malicious. He was just finished. She could see it in the way he sat in his chair, slightly sideways, as if already preparing to leave. He noted her diligence in her first quarterly review and spelled her name wrong. She spent 3 years in administrative work. She applied for an investigative position twice during that period. The first time she was told the position had been filled internally. The second time she was told her profile was strong, but they were looking for someone with more field exposure. She requested field exposure. It was granted in a form so limited, occasional ride-alongs, one supervised evidence collection, that it was barely distinguishable from not granting it. She documented everything, not out of suspicion at that point, out of habit, out of the ironed uniform logic of her childhood. In her 4th year, a case landed on a desk 2 floors above her and rolled downhill. A financial fraud investigation touching a medium-sized contractor with a federal contract. It needed someone who could parse documentation across 3 separate accounting systems and find where the money disappeared. Sutton, who was by then trying to do as little as possible before his retirement in 14 months, pointed up the chain when they asked him for a recommendation. The chain pointed down. The pointing eventually reached Veronica's desk. She worked the case for 4 months. She found $4.2 million in misdirected contract funds across 7 shell entities. The case went to prosecution. The contractor was convicted. Her name appeared in the case file at the precise level of visibility her rank deserved, which was to say it was there, but small, and no one above her grade made a particular point of it publicly. She was promoted. The promotion did not come with a ceremony or a speech. It came with a new desk assignment, a slightly different job code in the HR system, and a new supervisor named Richard Calloway. Calloway was different from Sutton in the way that a headache is different from a stomach ache. They were both problems, but they lived in different places and required different management. Calloway was 44. He had come up through the agency on the investigative track, which meant he had field experience, arrest experience, the specific credential that Veronica had been told twice she lacked. He wore this credential the way some men wear a watch, not to tell time, but to be seen having it. He was not openly hostile to Veronica. He was something more sophisticated than hostile. He was consistently, methodically, enthusiastically convinced that his own judgment should supersede hers on every matter where her judgment might otherwise have been visible. She brought a case theory to a team meeting in her 6th year. It concerned a pattern she had identified in federal procurement contracts, a rotation of vendors that on paper looked like competitive bidding and on closer examination was a choreographed cycle. She had spent 11 weeks building the pattern. She had cross-referenced 5 databases. She had drawn the map by hand on a Sunday in her apartment because she thought better that way. Calloway listened. He thanked her. 3 weeks later, he presented a version of the theory, simplified, with 2 of the key correlations missing, to senior leadership as his own. He did not credit her. When she raised this with him privately, he told her the theory as she presented it had needed significant refinement before it was ready for leadership, and that the refinement was his contribution, and that she should be pleased the work was moving forward. She sat across from him at his desk and looked at him. She did not say what she wanted to say. She thought about her mother ironing uniforms at 5 in the morning. She thought about doors that opened for some people. She said, "Okay, Richard, thank you for letting me know." She walked out of his office. She went to her car. She sat there for 12 minutes. She called her sister in Phoenix and said very little and listened to her sister talk about her kids for a while, which helped. Then she came back inside and started building her documentation. Not a complaint. Not yet. A record. Dates, meeting notes, email threads, versions of documents with timestamps. She had not been taught to do this by anyone. She had arrived at it through the same logic that had made her a good investigator. You could not argue against what was written down. The spoken word evaporates. Paper does not. She had watched prosecutions fail because the paper was wrong. She was not going to let her own case fail that way. For 2 more years, she worked under Calloway. She closed 4 significant cases. She received 3 commendations that were addressed to the team, which in practice meant they were addressed to Calloway, and she was included by implication. She requested a lateral transfer twice. Both requests were denied, citing operational continuity. In her ninth year, a new deputy director came in from outside the agency. His name was Thomas Braun. He had a reputation for shaking up what he called structural stagnation, which in federal bureaucracy is the kind of phrase that makes long-tenured people nervous and makes people like Veronica something between cautious and interested. She requested a meeting with Braun. She was given 15 minutes. She came with 12 minutes of prepared material and used 13. She did not complain about Callaway directly. She presented 3 case trajectories she believed the agency was missing with documentation, with projected outcomes, with resource requirements. She was specific. She was not performing. She was just showing someone a map she had been drawing for 9 years. Braun extended the meeting to 45 minutes. 3 months later, she was given her own unit. For investigators, a case portfolio, direct reporting to Braun. Callaway moved laterally in the same reorganization that elevated her. His expression at the all-hands announcement was the most information she had ever gotten from him for free. The next 18 months were the best of her professional life. She ran her unit with the same 15 minutes early logic that had run everything else. She built her investigators carefully. She looked for the ones who had been consistently underestimated, because those were the ones who had learned to be thorough rather than flashy. She brought in a woman named Priya Mehta who had been passed over twice for promotion. She brought in a man named Daniel Osei who had been sitting in the same grade for 4 years and whose case notes were the best she had ever read. She built the unit around precision. She built it around paper. They closed 11 major cases in 18 months. Their conviction rate was 94%. She was offered a promotion to unit chief. The increase in responsibility was significant. The increase in salary was modest. She took it because this was not about the salary. She was 41 years old, and she had spent 22 years showing up early, and the work was finally holding the shape she had imagined for it. This is the part where the second fall begins. It did not begin with a loud thing. It began with a reorganization. A new director came in above Braun. The new director had a different philosophy about investigative units. He believed in consolidation, in larger teams with standardized methods, in what he called operational efficiency, which Veronica had learned over 22 years was language that agencies used when they wanted to absorb something that was working and flatten it into something more manageable. Her unit was flagged for consolidation in the new structure. She was told she would retain her title, but her unit would be folded into a larger division under a division chief named Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb was 56, 29 years with the agency, and he had come up in the pre-Braun era, which meant he had come up in the Sutton Callaway era, and he brought with him the particular institutional memory of that time, including its views on who got credit for what, and who was asked to contribute from the background. She came to Webb's first unit meeting with her team's active case files organized and briefed. She had prepared talking points on each case, transition risks, current investigative status. She sat across the table from Webb and his existing team, and she presented her unit's portfolio with the same precision she brought to everything. Webb's team sat with their arms crossed. Webb himself listened with the particular expression of a man who has already decided and is listening only in order to fulfill the social obligation of appearing to listen. When she finished, he thanked her for the thorough brief and said that going forward, all active cases would be reassigned to senior investigators on his existing team to ensure continuity of approach. Priya Mehta was reassigned to document processing. Daniel Osei was moved to a support role. Veronica was given the title of senior analyst and a desk in an open plan office and a caseload that consisted primarily of reviewing other investigators' documentation for compliance. She had been document review before. She had been 15 minutes early to document review for 3 years. She understood what it meant when a document review role came without any path forward and with a supervisor who had already made his determinations. She sat at her new desk on the first day and she put her things in order. She had a photograph of her parents at her sister's wedding. She had a coffee mug that said nothing on it, which she preferred. She had her documentation, years of it organized and time-stamped and complete. She called no one that day to complain. She went home. She ate dinner. She looked at the wall for a while. Then she opened her laptop and she started writing. Not a grievance. Not yet. A timeline. Everything she had built. Every case. Every commendation. Every theft of credit. Every request denied. Every performance review compared against the objective case record. Every date, every name, every number. It took her 6 weeks to complete. When it was done, it was 214 pages. She read it through twice, made corrections, checked her citations, and then she called an employment attorney named Sandra Park, who had been recommended by a friend of a friend and whose specialty was federal workplace discrimination. Sandra Park had been doing this work for 19 years. She took the call on a Thursday evening. She asked Veronica to send the documentation. There was a silence on the phone that Veronica had learned to interpret over 22 years of reading rooms. Sandra Park said, "I'll need a few days to review this." Veronica said, "Take whatever time you need." She hung up and she made tea and she sat in her kitchen and she felt something she did not immediately name. It was not hope. Hope was too light for what this was. It was more structural than hope. It was the feeling of something load-bearing being set into the ground. Not relief. Foundation. The agency was not prepared for what Veronica Diaz had spent 22 years learning how to build. It did not know that yet. Sandra Park called back on a Monday. She said, "Veronica, this is a very good file." Veronica set down her coffee. "I know. We need to talk about what you want." Veronica thought about Calloway presenting her map to leadership as his own. She thought about Priya-Meta processing documents. She thought about Daniel Osei, who wrote the best case notes she had ever read, sitting in a support role. She thought about 22 years of 15 minutes early. "I want accountability," she said. "I want on the record, and I want my people taken care of." Sandra Park said, "Okay," and that was how it started. Not with anger, with 214 pages, and a woman who had spent her whole life learning that preparation was the only thing standing between her and the world's particular cruelty, and a phone call on a Monday, and 2 words from an attorney who had 19 years of experience and had just read the best documented federal workplace discrimination case she had seen in at least a decade. Okay, the agency was not ready. It did not know it was not ready. That was the other part of what made it not ready. In the weeks that followed, Veronica went to work every morning at her open plan desk in her senior analyst role, and she reviewed compliance documentation, and she was precise, and she was thorough, and she was 15 minutes early, and she said good morning to people in the hallway, and she gave nothing away. The documentation she had given Sandra Park was doing its own work somewhere else, moving through systems, building toward a hearing, beginning the slow, institutional grind that federal employment law runs on, which is not fast, but which, when the paper is right, is inexorable. Webb passed her desk twice a day. He gave her the particular nod of a man who believed he had solved a problem and was pleased with the solution. She nodded back. She gave him nothing. She was building something he could not see. She had been building things he could not see for 22 years. The only difference was that now she had a lawyer. Her mother called on a Wednesday evening during this period. They talked for an hour about nothing particularly serious. Her nephew's baseball, a neighbor's dog, whether the gas prices in El Paso were better or worse than they were 2 years ago. Before they hung up, her mother said, "You sound okay." Veronica said, "I am okay." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, she said the thing that she had been saying in various forms since Veronica was old enough to iron her own uniform. "Make sure your work is tight." Veronica said, "It's tight, Mom." It was tight. It was 214 pages of tight. The hearing date was set for 4 months out. The agency's legal counsel received the filing, and Veronica knew this not because anyone told her, but because she had spent 22 years reading institutional behavior, and it was as predictable as weather. Began the process of deciding whether to fight, settle, or do what federal agencies almost always do first, which is attempt to make the complainant feel that the process is so long and so costly and so uncertain that walking away is the rational choice. Veronica had anticipated this. She had documented her anticipation of it, which was not a thing most people thought to do, and which was one of the reasons Sandra Park had said what she said on that Monday phone call. She did not walk away. She woke up at 5 in the morning, which was earlier than she needed to, and she made coffee, and she sat with everything she knew, and she let it hold its shape. She had been here before. Different institution, same architecture. She had been the woman who was asked to work harder and receive less and be grateful for the less because the more was apparently not something that opened for people like her. She had watched it happen to Priya. She had watched it happen to Daniel. She was not going to be quiet about it anymore. Not loud. She was not built for loud. But she was done being quiet. The agency's legal counsel sent an initial response through Sandra Park. It used language that translated for people who did not speak bureaucratic legal to, "We dispute the characterization of events," and "would be open to a conversation about resolution." Sandra Park translated it for Veronica over the phone, efficiently and without drama. Veronica said, "What does a conversation about resolution mean?" Sandra Park said, "It means they want to know your number before they decide whether to fight." Veronica thought about this. She thought about Priya Mehta. She thought about Daniel Osei. She said, "My number includes my people." Sandra said, "Say more." And Veronica said more. She said more precisely, with specifics, with names and dates and documented case contributions and objective performance metrics. She had been building this for 22 years without knowing exactly what she was building it for. She knew now. She hung up. She went to work. She was 15 minutes early. Nobody in that building knew what was coming. That was the end of the beginning. The agency's legal team had a name. For names, actually a lead counsel and 3 associates out of the Department of Justice's Employment Division, the kind of institutional muscle that federal agencies deploy when they want the other side to look at the width of the machinery and decide the math doesn't work in their favor. Veronica got their names from the first formal response filing. She looked each one up. She read their case histories where those were available. She was not trying to find weakness. She was trying to understand what kind of mind she was dealing with, the way she would read a subject before an interview. The lead counsel was named Howard Farrell. He had 24 years in federal employment defense. His record on discrimination cases that reached formal hearing was 71% in favor of the agency. His record on cases that were filed with the documentation level of Veronica's was something she could not find in public records because cases with documentation like hers tended not to make it to formal hearing. They settled. She noted this. She told Sandra. Sandra said, "Farrell is good. He's also institutional. He'll try to make you feel small and far away." Veronica said, "I've been made to feel small and far away before." She went to work. The discovery process in federal employment cases is its own particular kind of suffering. It requires the releasing of records, emails, personnel files, meeting notes, internal communications, documents that institutions spend significant energy keeping internal, now required to become visible. Veronica had spent 11 years learning how to read institutional documents. She had spent 22 years producing them. She understood that what organizations put in writing and what they believe are often 2 different things, and that the distance between those 2 things is where cases are won. The agency's document production arrived in batches over 6 weeks. Sandra's team processed them. Veronica reviewed them personally, evenings and weekends, with a yellow legal pad and a system of notation she had developed over years of casework. She was looking for the gap between the policy language and the practice record. She knew the gap was there. Institutions that had treated people the way this one had treated her always had the gap. It was just a question of where it lived in the paper. She found the first significant gap in week 3. The agency's official promotion criteria document, version 4.2, last updated 18 months before her demotion into the senior analyst role, contained a specific clause about performance-based advancement. The clause established that any investigator with a conviction rate above 85% and 3 or more commendations within a rolling 4-year period was to receive automatic consideration for senior leadership track. Not guaranteed promotion, but guaranteed formal review. Her conviction rate, 94%. Her commendations in the relevant 4-year period, 5, including 2 that had been awarded to her team under Callaway's name, but whose underlying casework was documented in her hand. Formal leadership track review she had received, 0. She copied the clause. She cross-referenced it against her personnel file, which had been produced in discovery. She found no record of any leadership track review ever being initiated for her file, which meant the agency had either failed to follow its own written policy or had made an active decision not to, and if it was the latter, there would be a record of that decision somewhere in the document production. And if there was a record of that decision, it would be signed by someone, and that someone would need to explain in a deposition why a woman with a 94% conviction rate and 5 commendations had never been considered for a review that its own policy required. She put this in a legal pad. She called Sandra in the morning. Sandra said, "Where in the production?" Veronica gave her the batch number, document number, and page. She had organized Sandra's production for her because she could not help it. Sandra had stopped being surprised by this weeks ago. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This is the kind of thing you put on the first slide." Veronica said, "I know." The deposition of Marcus Webb was scheduled for a Thursday morning in a conference room at a law firm in the federal district. Veronica was not required to be present. She came anyway. She sat against the wall, and she was still. Webb came in with Farrell and one of the associates. He was wearing a suit she had not seen him wear before, which meant he had dressed for this specifically, which meant he was more concerned than he appeared at the office. She filed this away. Sandra conducted the deposition. She had a method. She spent the first 40 minutes asking questions whose answers were obvious and harmless, building a record of Webb stating things as fact, establishing that he recalled the relevant time period clearly and in detail. She was calibrating his confidence, giving him room to grow comfortable. Veronica watched Webb's posture loosen over those 40 minutes. His arms uncrossed. He leaned back slightly. Farrell, who had been watching carefully, also relaxed by a degree that suggested he believed the first 40 minutes was representative of the whole. Sandra asked Webb about the promotion criteria policy, version 4.2. Webb said he was familiar with the policy. Sandra asked whether he was familiar with the leadership track review provision. Webb said yes. Sandra asked whether he had ever initiated a leadership track review for Veronica Diaz. Webb said the decision about her unit's integration into his division had been a structural one, and the leadership track review process was separate from that process. Sandra asked whether the policy distinguished between structural reorganizations and standard personnel decisions when it came to the leadership track review trigger. Webb said he believed it did. Sandra produced the policy document and placed it in front of him. She asked him to find the provision he was referring to. He looked at the document for 90 seconds. Farrell looked at the document. The associate looked at the document. The provision Webb was referring to did not exist. What the document said was that the leadership track review was triggered by performance criteria. Full stop. No carve-out for reorganizations. No exception for structural integrations. Performance criteria, which Veronica had met, which the document proved she had met, which the agency had been required to initiate a review for and had not. Webb said, "I may be recalling a prior version of the policy." Sandra said, "Which version were you operating under at the time of the reorganization?" Webb said, "I would need to check the documentation." Sandra placed in front of him the email chain from the agency's policy office confirming that version 4.2 had been in effect and had been circulated to all division chiefs, including Webb 18 months before the reorganization. The deposition room was very quiet. Farrell called for a 10-minute break. In the hallway, Veronica stood by a window that looked out over the federal district. She drank water from a paper cup. She felt the thing she had felt in her kitchen the night she finished the 214 pages. Not hope, not relief. Foundation. Something set into the ground. Something that held weight. She went back in and sat against the wall, and she was still. The deposition continued for another 3 hours. By the end, the record contained Webb's acknowledgement that he had not followed the written policy. His explanation was that the reorganization context had led him to believe the situation was different. He had no documentation of anyone telling him the situation was different. He had no documentation of consulting legal counsel before making the personnel decisions. He had the particular quality of a man who had made a decision he assumed no one would ever look at closely, and who was now in a room where someone was looking at it closely, and who had no way to close the gap between what he had done and what the written policy required. Veronica watched Farrell's face during the last hour of the deposition. He was recalibrating. She knew that look. She had seen it on subjects. The look of a person who came in with a theory of the situation and is updating in real time because the evidence is not cooperating with the theory. Farrell's theory, she suspected, had been that this was a disgruntled employee with some documentation and a sympathetic attorney, and that the documentation would show inconsistencies when pressure was applied, and that the case would settle for a number that didn't require the agency to admit anything significant. The deposition of Marcus Webb had made it clear that there was not going to be a comfortable settlement number, because this was not a documentation problem. This was a policy compliance problem, and policy compliance problems had witnesses, and The witnesses were the documents, and the documents were now in the record. The deposition of Richard Calloway was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Calloway arrived in a different kind of suit. Expensive, careful. The suit of a man who had been practicing in a mirror. He had clearly been briefed by Farrell. He was specific, measured, and controlled in a way that men like Calloway are only when they have been told specifically to be. He denied presenting her work as his own. He characterized his contribution to the team's case development as supervisory integration of multiple team members' inputs. He used the phrase supervisory integration 4 times in the first hour. Sandra asked him about the case theory Veronica had presented in the team meeting in her 6th year. She had documentation of the meeting. She had Veronica's notes from before the meeting time-stamped. She had the date of Calloway's presentation to leadership. She had the version he presented with its 2 missing correlations, and she had Veronica's original version with those correlations present in a document produced in discovery from the agency's own system, time-stamped 3 weeks before Calloway's presentation. She put them side by side. She asked Calloway to explain the relationship between the 2 documents. He said Veronica's document was a preliminary draft that he had refined and completed before presenting. Sandra asked whether the metadata on Veronica's document, which showed the date of her last edit as the evening before his presentation, supported his characterization of it as a preliminary draft. Calloway said metadata could reflect multiple things. Sandra asked whether there was any document in the record showing his contribution to the refinement he was describing. He said the work had been collaborative. Sandra asked whether there was a single email, a single meeting note, a single version of the document with his edits in it that showed his involvement in the refinement. He said some work was done verbally. Sandra placed in front of him the agency's own policy on documenting collaborative investigative work, which required that all significant analytical contributions to an active case be logged in the case management system under the contributing individual's user credentials. She asked him to show her his log entries on the case in question. He could not. His log entries from the relevant period showed administrative actions, reviews, approvals, nothing that could be described as analytical contribution to the theory she had built. The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms get quiet when the paper has said the final thing. Farrell called for a break again. Veronica noted that he was calling breaks more frequently than most defense counsel did, which meant he was using the breaks for something, which meant he was making calls. She was right about this. She found out later through Sandra, who found out through the kind of professional network that people doing this work develop over 19 years. Farrell had called his senior contact at the agency after the Webb deposition. He had called again after the Calloway deposition. The second call had contained language that Sandra paraphrased as the agency's leadership being made aware that the exposure was significant. Significant exposure in federal employment law is a phrase that translates into money, into public record, into institutional acknowledgement that the policy had been violated and the person whose career it had violated was right. The agency did not want that on the public record. They came back with a settlement offer 3 days after the Calloway deposition. Sandra called Veronica on a Tuesday evening. She read her the number. Veronica sat with it. The number was real. It was the kind of number that changed things practically, that addressed the years and the cases and the credit that had been taken and the promotions that had not come. It was accompanied by a standard non-disclosure agreement, which was how settlements worked, and a standard non-admission of wrongdoing clause, which was also how settlements worked. She sat with the number. She thought about what she had told Sandra at the beginning. I want accountability. I want on the record. And I want my people taken care of. The number addressed one of those 3 things. The non-disclosure agreement worked against a second. The non-admission clause worked against a third. She said, what happens if we reject it and go to hearing? Sandra said, we have a strong case. We also have a federal agency with unlimited counsel hours and a judiciary system that moves slowly, and the hearing is 8 months out, and you would need to keep your current position or transition out during those 8 months, and none of that is comfortable. Veronica said, what's your read? Sandra said, my read is that we can get more. I think they're scared. I think the Webb and Calloway depositions scared them. I think if we counter with specific demands around the record, not just the money, they'll move. Specific demands around the record. A formal written acknowledgement that the promotion policy was not followed. In their internal HR records. Not public, but permanent. and reinstatement of Priya Mehta and Daniel Osei to investigative roles with backdated seniority credits. Veronica was very still. She said, "Can we get that?" Sandra said, "I think we can try for it." She thought about Priya processing documents. She thought about Daniel, whose case notes she still thought about sometimes. The precision, the care, the way he wrote the smallest detail as if he understood the smallest detail might be the one that mattered. She said, "Counter it." Sandra said, "Okay." 3 weeks of back in, fourth followed. The agency came in, revised. Sandra pushed back, specific and documented, as was her method. Farrell, Veronica was told indirectly, had apparently said to someone on the agency side that this particular plaintiff's attorney was not one who was going to be satisfied with a number and a handshake, and that they should prepare to address substance. The agency was not accustomed to addressing substance. It was accustomed to making the number large enough that substance became academic. It had not anticipated Veronica Diaz, who had spent 22 years learning that substance was the only thing you could count on. The negotiation broke for a long weekend at the end of the third week and resumed on a Monday. The Monday session lasted 6 hours. Sandra was in a conference room with Farrell and a deputy from the agency's HR division who had been brought in specifically for the personnel reinstatement question, and Veronica sat in Sandra's office and read case law and drank bad office coffee and waited. Sandra came back at 4 in the afternoon. She sat down. She looked at Veronica. She said, "Priya gets reinstated as a senior investigator. Seniority credit back 2 years. Daniel gets reinstated as an investigator with 1 year credit. The formal written acknowledgement goes into both your file and webs. The number increases by 30% from their initial offer. The NDA scope is narrowed. You could discuss the factual outcome, but not the settlement terms." Veronica looked at her. Sandra said, "It's not everything, but it's most of the things you said you wanted." She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "The written acknowledgement in Webb's file. What does it say?" Sandra said, "It documents a policy compliance failure in the handling of the 2019 reorganization and notes it as a formal finding in his supervisory record." Veronica said, "Permanent." Sandra said, "Permanent." She sat with this, with what it meant that a document would exist, time-stamped, in a federal HR system, signed by people above Webb's pay grade, saying what the paper had always said, that the policy had been violated, that she had been right, that it was written down. She thought about her mother, who had ironed 4 children's uniforms before 5 in the morning, so that certain teachers could not use appearance as the thing they used to diminish her children. Her mother had understood something that Veronica had spent 22 years relearning. You could not argue with what was neat, what was prepared, what was exactly as it should be on the surface, because the surface was the only battlefield where the fight was always fair. Her paper was neat. Her case was prepared. It was exactly as it should be. She said, "Okay." Sandra said, "Okay." The settlement documents were finalized over the following week. Veronica signed on a Friday afternoon in Sandra's office with a pen she had brought from home. She did not know why she had brought it from home. She had not decided to do it consciously. It was just the pen she used. That evening she called her sister in Phoenix. She did not say much. Her sister, who had been around Veronica for 40 years and knew when the silence was carrying something, waited. Veronica said, "It's done." Her sister said, "Yeah." She said, "Yeah." Her sister said, "Mom's going to want to know." Veronica said, "I'll call her tomorrow." That night she ate dinner alone, and she sat in her kitchen, and she felt something she had no precise word for. It was not triumph. Triumph was too loud. It was something quieter. The satisfaction of a well-built thing holding under pressure. The way a wall holds when the weight is correctly distributed. The way a document holds when the dates are right and the versions are correct and the policy language says what it says, and there is nothing the other side can insert into the gap between what was done and what should have been done. She had built that wall for 22 years. It had held. Priya Mehta got the call on a Monday. She called Veronica that evening and could not finish a sentence for 2 minutes. Veronica listened. She did not fill the silence. She had learned a long time ago that some silences were working and you did not interrupt working silence. Daniel Osei sent a text message that said, "I don't know what you did, but I know what you did. Thank you." She read it 3 times. She put her phone down. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about 286 Navy SEALs. She did not know them yet. That was coming. The second institution had not yet appeared. She had just finished with the first. But the 286, they were already out there, being what they were, not knowing that a woman they had never heard of was sitting in her kitchen in the federal district with a settlement in her file, and 2 colleagues back in the work they were built for, and a permanent document in a supervisor's HR record saying what the paper had always said. They would find out about her. They would find out because the second institution, the one she trusted even more, the one she gave even more of herself to, it had not yet begun its particular cruelty. And when it did, it would make the first one look like practice. She did not know this yet. She made tea. She went to bed. She was 15 minutes early the next morning. She always was. The second institution had a flag. Not a corporate logo. Not an agency seal. An actual flag. It flew outside a building in Virginia where the parking lot had its own security checkpoint. And the people who worked inside had earned their positions in water and cold and decisions made under the kind of pressure that turns ordinary human reasoning into something that has to be rebuilt from scratch. This was a consulting and training organization that served the special operations community. Its clients were active and former military. Its reputation was built on a specific kind of rigor that civilian institutions spent a lot of money trying to simulate and almost never achieved. Veronica Diaz joined it 2 years after the settlement. She left the federal agency not because she lost, but because she had won everything she was going to win there, and she was 43 years old, and the ceiling was in a different place than the one she wanted. She took the knowledge she had built, investigative methodology, compliance architecture, the specific science of building cases that hold, and she translated it into a consulting framework. She had been approached twice during her federal career about consulting work and had declined both times because she was not finished with what she was building inside. Now she was finished, or rather, she had finished what could be finished there, and she understood the difference. The Special Operations Consulting Organization, she later referred to it publicly by its initials, STO Consulting, to protect the ongoing legal record, recruited her through a contact who had seen her present at a federal law enforcement conference 6 months after the settlement. She had given a 40-minute talk on documentation architecture in complex workplace investigations. The room had been half empty when she started. By the end, it was standing room. The person who recruited her had been in the back row. She joined STO as Director of Compliance and Investigative Services. The title was accurate. The organization's clients included federal contractors, defense firms, and active special operations training programs. Her job was to build and run the compliance infrastructure, internal investigations, policy architecture, ethics reporting systems. She was also tasked with building a training curriculum in investigative methodology for the organization's personnel, many of whom were former special operations, who had extraordinary operational skills and almost no formal training in the kind of documentation and process architecture that complex institutional environments require. She was good at this. She was, by this point in her life, very specifically good at exactly this. It was the work she had been building toward for 22 years without always knowing that was what she was building toward. The organization had 2 founders. One of them, a former SEAL named Connor Rask, was the public face, the one who did the speaking engagements and the interviews and the military memoir that had sold reasonably well. The other, a man named Philip Garrett, was the operational mind. He held the financial architecture of the organization, the client relationships, the contractual framework that made the revenue work. He was in his late 50s, precise in a way that people who have spent decades managing complex systems become precise, and he had brought Veronica in because he believed the organization's internal infrastructure had not kept pace with its growth and that the gap was a liability. He was right. The gap was a liability. She saw it within the first 6 weeks. The compliance systems were 3 generations behind the organization size. The ethics reporting mechanism was a form on an internal server that no one had reviewed the submissions of in 14 months. The investigation protocol for personnel complaints was a 4-page document that had not been updated since the organization's founding and contained 2 provisions that were in direct conflict with current federal contractor requirements. The documentation practices across the operational divisions were inconsistent to the point of being, in a legal exposure sense, useful to no one but a plaintiff's attorney. She told Garrett this in a structured briefing in her 8th week. She had a presentation. She had specific findings. She had a timeline for remediation and a resource estimate. Garrett listened in the way she had learned to distinguish from actual listening. He was present, he asked appropriate questions, he nodded at the right intervals. She believed, at that meeting, that he was hearing her. He approved her remediation plan. She built it out over 6 months. New ethics reporting system with a real intake process and documented review cycles. Updated investigation protocol that matched current law and included protections for both complainants and respondents. Training for all division heads. Documentation standards rolled out across operational units with a compliance calendar. Rask engaged minimally. He was focused on the external work, the speaking, the client development, the brand. He was good at those things. He treated the internal compliance work as something that existed in the background. The way people treat infrastructure, important in the abstract, invisible when functioning, noticeable only when it breaks. She thought about this later. She thought about how the work she did best was exactly the kind of work that became invisible when it worked, and how that invisibility was the original source of everything she had been fighting against for 22 years. Good compliance is silence. Good investigation is paper that no one ever has to use. Good policy architecture is the absence of the crisis it was built to prevent. None of those things look like anything from the outside. They look like nothing. And looking like nothing in institutions that reward visibility is its own particular trap. She stayed anyway. The work was real. The clients were serious. And for 2 years, the organization functioned at a level it had not before. And she was the reason, and even if Garrett and Rask did not fully understand what she had built for them, it was built and it was holding. In her 3rd year, the organization won a significant contract. The contract was with a DoD-adjacent program that was running a leadership development and selection assessment for special operations candidates. The scope was large, multi-year, multi-cohort, involving hundreds of participants across multiple training cycles. The revenue impact on the organization was substantial. Rask announced it at an all-hands meeting with the particular energy of a man who had brought in something he intended to be remembered for. The compliance requirements that came with the contract were also substantial. Federal contractor compliance at this scale meant documentation at a level the organization had not operated at before, even with the systems Veronica had built. It meant reporting requirements, audit readiness, data handling protocols, privacy architecture. She briefed Garrett on this within a week of the contract announcement. She told him what would need to be built, what would need to be maintained, and what the consequences of non-compliance at this contract scale looked like. Garrett said he understood. Over the following months, the pressure the new contract created on staffing, on operational tempo, on the revenue logic of the organization began to reshape how decisions were made. Not through any single explicit shift, but through the accumulation of small decisions, each of which made a certain kind of immediate sense and which together created a pattern that she recognized. She recognized it because she had seen it before. Not here, in the federal agency, in the years before she built the 214-page file. It was the pattern of an institution under pressure beginning to treat its internal compliance infrastructure as friction rather than foundation, starting to route around the systems rather than through them, making exceptions, moving faster than the documentation could follow, deciding in the specific calculus of institutions that are growing too fast for their own architecture that the person responsible for slowing things down for the sake of getting things right was a person who was not quite aligned with where the organization was going. She documented what she observed, not out of paranoia, out of the same habit that had made her a good investigator for 22 years. She saw the pattern. She wrote down what she saw. She continued doing her job. The first explicit signal came in her 37th month. Garrett asked her to sign off on a documentation submission for the DoD contract that she had not reviewed. The deadline for the submission was that day. The document was a compliance attestation, a formal statement that certain protocols were in place and functioning. She had seen a prior version of the relevant protocols. She had concerns about 2 of them. She had raised those concerns in writing 3 weeks earlier. She had received no formal response. She told Garrett she could not sign the attestation without reviewing the current protocol status. He told her the deadline was the deadline, and the client expected the submission, and this was the kind of thing she needed to be flexible about. She said, "Richard," and then stopped. His name was Philip. She had called him Richard. She registered this. What it meant that the name that came out of her mouth was Calloway's. She said, "Philip, if the protocols aren't current, and I attest that they are, that's a federal compliance violation on a DoD contract. That's not flexibility. That's exposure." He said the protocols were close enough, and the concerns she had raised were being addressed. She said, "I need that in writing before I can sign." He looked at her with the expression of a man who had decided something and was now encountering the obstacle of her being correct about it. She did not sign. The attestation was submitted without her signature. She found this out 2 days later. When she asked Garrett who had signed it, he said the submission had gone out under Rask's authorization as founding director. She documented this immediately. Date, time, conversation summary, the fact that the attestation had been submitted without the compliance director's signature, the name of the individual who had authorized the submission, the prior written communication establishing her concerns about the underlying protocols. She sent a copy of the documentation to her personal email. She had a system for this. She had always had a system for this. She also, that same afternoon, sent a written inquiry to the organization's legal counsel. Not Garrett's attorney, but the outside firm that handled their federal contractor compliance matters, asking for clarification on the legal obligations of a compliance director who had been excluded from a federal attestation submission. The response from the outside counsel came back in 48 hours. It was careful, precise, and said exactly what she expected it to say. A compliance director who had been excluded from a required attestation process and who had documented their concerns in writing prior to the exclusion had a clear record demonstrating non-involvement in the submission and had an obligation under federal contractor regulations to report material compliance concerns through the appropriate channels, which included the contracting agency's inspector general if internal. Channels were not responsive. She read it twice. She called Sandra Park. Sandra had not heard from her in 2 years. She answered on the second ring. Veronica said, "I need to talk to you." Sandra said, "Tell me." She talked for 22 minutes. She was precise. She gave Sandra the timeline, the documentation, the specific regulatory provisions, the attestation issue, the pattern she had observed over the preceding months. She did not editorialize. She did not perform. She just gave Sandra the information the way she had been giving people information her entire adult life. Sandra was quiet for a moment when she finished. Then she said, "Veronica, are you still in possession of the documentation from your federal case?" She said yes. Sandra said, "And you're keeping a contemporaneous record of the current situation?" She said yes. Sandra said, "I need you to do one more thing." "What?" "I need you to request a meeting with both founders about your concerns. In writing, with a read receipt." Veronica said, "So there's a record of whether they respond." Sandra said, "So there's a record of whether they respond." She sent the meeting request that evening. She kept the language precise and professional. She cited the specific compliance concerns and the attestation situation. She requested a meeting within 10 business days. She used language that would mean something to someone reading it who understood federal contractor compliance law, without being accusatory to someone reading it without that context. Garrett responded within 2 hours. The response said that her concerns would be discussed at the next leadership team meeting, which was scheduled in 3 weeks. She sent a follow-up the same evening noting that certain of the compliance concerns were time-sensitive given the contract reporting cycle and asking whether an earlier meeting was possible. No response came. On the 9th business day, she sent a follow-up to both Garrett and Rask. On the 11th business day, she received a meeting request. Not from Garrett, from Rask. The subject line said, "Organizational Direction Discussion." She knew what that meant before she opened the calendar invite. She had been in enough of these situations to know the shape of them. She accepted the meeting. She went home, and she made coffee, and she sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and her documentation, and she spent the next 4 hours making sure everything was organized and backed up and that Sandra had access to everything she needed. She was not scared. She was something closer to the feeling she'd had after the Calloway deposition. The particular readiness of a person whose paper is in order, whose case is built, who has nothing to protect because everything worth protecting is already in the record. The meeting with Rask was in his office The large one with the framed photographs from his military career, the walls of credential. He was doing a version of the thing Garrett had done, try to be precise and measured, but Rask was not a precise and measured man by nature, and the effort showed. He was used to the external audience, used to the story, used to rooms that wanted what he was offering. She was not a room that wanted what he was offering. He told her that the organization's needs had evolved and that her role as currently structured was not aligned with where the organization was going. He told her that her contributions had been significant and that the transition would be handled with respect. He used the word transition twice and the word valued 3 times. She asked him specifically what had changed about the organization's compliance needs. He said they were looking for a different approach going forward. She asked him to define the different approach. He said the organization needed someone who could be more integrated with the operational leadership. She said, I want to make sure I understand. The compliance director who documented concerns about a federal attestation submission is being transitioned out of her role because she is not integrated enough with the leadership that submitted the attestation without her signature. He said that was not how he would characterize it. She said, how would you characterize it? He said the organizational direction had evolved. She looked at him. She thought about her father sitting very still for a long time before saying that some doors open for some people and not for others. She thought about her mother and the ironing and the 5 in the morning and the teachers were waiting for an opening. She thought about 214 pages. She thought about whatever she was going to build now. She said, okay. She stood up. She thanked him for his time. She walked out of his office with the particular composure of a woman who knows exactly where every document is. She called Sandra on the way to the parking lot. Sandra picked up. Veronica said, they just did it again. Sandra said, when's your last day? She said, you didn't give me a specific date yet. I'll get it in writing. Sandra said, get it in writing. She said, I know. She got in her car. She sat for a moment. Outside, the flag was moving in the November wind. The actual flag, the one on the pole in front of the building, because this was the kind of institution that flew an actual flag. She looked at it for a moment. She started the car. She had been in this parking lot before. Not this lot. The other one. The gas station sandwich. The 11-minute cry. The starting over. She was not doing that again. She had not been doing that again since the 214 pages. She had learned in the years between the first fall and this one that the parking lot cry was a legitimate part of the process, and also that it was not the end of the process. It was just the moment when the body admitted what the mind already knew. She did not cry in the parking lot this time. She drove home. She made dinner. She ate it at her kitchen table, and she looked at the wall. The documentation she had built on STO consulting was not 214 pages. It was leaner, more targeted, more precisely engineered for the specific regulatory context of federal contractor compliance. It was the work of a woman who had done this once already and had learned from the first time what was necessary and what was not. She picked up her phone. She texted Sandra, ready when you are. Sandra responded with a single word, building. Outside, it was November, the kind of cold that makes things clear. She had been built for this, she understood. Not the falling, the building, the specific knowledge of what holds and what doesn't. The architecture of cases that cannot be argued against because the paper is right and the dates are right and the policy language says what it says. She was going to build the best thing she had ever built. She was going to build it in the full view of 286 men who had spent their careers learning to recognize what could be broken and what could not. And they were going to understand exactly what they were looking at.